Hello and welcome to the Four Wheel Dive Podcast. I'm Tim Masso and he is Kyle Lindsay, YouTube's original king of cars. The Drive and Dive starts now. All right, today's episode is titled, Whoa, Did You Know? We have 20 fun facts about cars. Kyle, lead off.
There are so many cool things to talk about. Oh, what should I start out with? So did you know that the whole concept of push button ignition is not a new thing at all? You know, it's pretty much standard in every vehicle nowadays, and we started seeing it become a lot more prevalent in the mid to late 2000s. And I remember, man, I hate push button ignition. I just like the feeling of being able to put the key in and turn it on and all that stuff, and you really can't do that anymore. But my 1948 Ford Super Deluxe has push button ignition, but you actually had to turn the ignition key first and then hit the button underneath the dash. That was actually a pretty common thing way back in the day.
Yeah, I want to say that Buicks back in like 1947, 48, 49, back in the straight eight days, I want to say that you had to activate the car with the ignition key, and then you would put your foot to the floor, mat out the throttle, and the car would always start up with a roar because it was basically push button with the gas pedal.
Absolutely. And I forgot about that. I'm glad you brought that up. I think Studebaker had the exact same feature. I've got a 1949 Commander Regal Deluxe Starlight Coupe, and I think it starts up the same way. I can't verify that because it's a long way off from that, but that's a really cool fact.
You know, the first time I can remember seeing that on a modern car was probably in 2002 with the Aston Martin Vanquish, the first Vanquish. And I remember seeing that and thinking it was really cool at the time. Now you get in the car with your phone enabled, the car's just ready to go. It's so weird in the era of connected cars.
It's crazy how the younger generation, like it's hard. Well, it's weird to say. I'm 33 years old now. I'm starting to talk about the younger generation, but it's funny. Like, people born in like the early, 2000, they're like turning 22 this year. I feel old, but most of these people don't know about the key life. They don't remember about, when you needed two keys to work your car, one to do the doors and the ignition, the other one to do like the glove box and the trunk.
Yeah. The further back you go, the worse it gets, like wheel locks, hood locks, trunk locks. You get back to the 1920s and 30s, you've got 4 or 5 keys. But if you've got that kind of car with that many locks, your chauffeur generally would handle the keys.
Absolutely.
So, by the way, I remember back in the early 2010s when the Prius C first came to market, one of the pitches was that it would appeal to older people because it was the only Prius at the time that you could start with a key.
That's cool. Good to know.
The way we were. Okay, gas turbine cars. So the fun thing about gas turbine cars is they pretty much date to the dawn of the jet age. A gas turbine in general is a jet engine that has been geared to do work mechanically rather than by the expulsion of gases. So it doesn't make you move by blowing out exhaust out the back the way a jet engine does. It runs a turbine shaft, a power takeoff, into a gearbox, which then drives wheels or a propeller or some sort of a mill. And in the early 1950s, Chrysler started playing around with turbines for cars. And this was the same era when the first generation Hemi was hitting the market. They were already thinking about turbines, and the idea percolated, and it eventually wound its way to racing by the 1960s. Not Chrysler specifically, but a name associated more with Studebaker, Andy Granatelli, who was a prolific hot rodder. He designed the R3 and the R4 Studebaker engines. He entered a car. It was a 4-wheel drive STP Paxton turbo car, and it had a gas turbine engine. And in the Indy 500, back when you could enter all sorts of crazy things in the Indy 500, it came within 3 laps of winning before Parnelli Jones blew a $6 transmission bearing. And who knows how the world would have changed if that car had made it 3 more laps and won the Indy 500? Because back then, the Indy 500 was bigger. I mean, Indy racing was bigger than football. Like the Indy 500 was bigger than the Super Bowl. That would have changed the world. You would have seen people seriously considering gas turbine cars. And, the difference was 3 laps. Chrysler did a trial with gas turbine cars in the early 60s. They accumulated over, I want to say, 1 million miles on US roads between 63 and 66. They made 55 of these. They were Ghia bodied. And for the most part, it was very successful. But as part of Chrysler's bailout from the Carter administration in the late 70s, they had to stop development of the turbine because people in Washington were convinced it was just a red herring. It was a dead end. Don't bother. And I feel like we came so close between Indy racing and Chrysler's R&D to having jet turbine powered cars, and they could run on anything: peanut oil, Chanel number 5 gasoline, ethanol. A lot of flexibility there. What could have been.
Absolutely. And, with the gas crisis and stuff of the 70s and how that affected emissions and performance in general, and how that, carried over into the 80s, the malaise era that we we weirdly like so much. It's really amazing when you think about just the amount of technology and stuff that could have been and could have affected things and whatnot, and it just never really materialized. Like now we're so hyper focused on electric is the big thing, but there's a lot of pros to electric. There's also a lot of drawbacks, and there's really no other big media innovation happening right now with alternative propulsion and stuff like they were trying out way back in the day. So it would be really nice to see something like that come about. It's high time for some serious new innovation, I think.
I would have loved to have seen it. The problem with the gas turbine was always, from an emission standpoint, in general, the hotter your engine burns and the higher the pressure it develops, the more nitrogen oxides it produces. And that's what the reduction phase of a catalytic converter is there. It's to reduce oxides of nitrogen. Well, Chrysler engineers just about had this fixed in the late 70s. And it would have given us a lot of flexibility to basically run a car on anything combustible. And that was the beauty of the gas turbine. That and jet-powered cars just sound cool.
Oh, absolutely. There's probably all sorts of legal ramifications and things you'd have to figure out with all of that.
Okay, yeah, I mean, if they didn't have like exhaust gas recirculation, I can imagine like modern like polyurethane bumpers just melting behind a jet-powered car, just like folding and like warping.
Absolutely.
I got a fun fact within a fun fact. I just remembered this. Back when Speed Vision had something called The Lost Drive-In with Bruce Dern, it was like old car movies. There was a movie from the 60s called The Lively Set, and the Chrysler turbine car played a rather prominent role in the movie as a turbine car, which was just weird because it was such an obscure thing. It was like the focal point of a movie that wasn't, as far as I know, like paid for by Chrysler. So check that out. See if you can find The Lively Set.
Oh, definitely. That's so cool. Going along with our discussion of technology and stuff, we really take for granted the amount of technology that comes standard in every single vehicle nowadays. And I guess several of my my interesting facts probably stem from the technology realm. But did you know the first car radio came out in 1922 from Chevrolet, and the government tried to ban these radios because they considered it a distraction of driving.
That's actually really funny because a lot of people made the same argument against windshield wipers.
Oh my gosh. It's wild because and up until like 1963, I believe it was, by that time most vehicles were offered with radios. It still wasn't a standard feature, but nowadays I don't well, at least for maybe the past 2 decades, you might not be able to find a vehicle that did not offer some kind of entertainment device.
Yeah, I would say your only chance, I mean, you have to go back pretty far at this point, like to the 80s, but I think the Ferrari Testarossa is sold in the United States, did not come with a radio. You would buy the car and then the Ferrari dealer would install an aftermarket radio. That's why a lot of Testarossas have Alpines.
That makes a lot of sense. I've always wondered that. Like all these like specific year range Ferraris, they all had the same like old school Alpine head units in them, and I was like,
Yes.
are people really swapping all of those out? I mean, they probably did, but that makes a lot of sense. Interesting.
So that's how that happened right there. I got another fun fact. Today, I mean, this isn't one of my fun facts. I'm just going to mention that today the distraction is all about the stuff that you have in the car, from games to movies to streaming podcasts, making sure that if the passenger has a screen, the driver cannot simultaneously look at that screen and watch it.
Interestingly enough that you say that. So when I started taking car reviews again a few months back, the first one that I had was the new Jeep Grand Cherokee 4xe, and that has an optional passenger side screen, which I think the Grand Wagoneer does too. But that has an anti-glare display built into it. You can only really see it if you're looking straight on, but if you're looking at it from the driver's side, it looks black.
The legacy of the radio, telematics and in-car entertainment.
It's wild.
Okay, so now we're talking about entertainment, car-centric entertainment, but not necessarily entertainment in your car. So Top Gear is the world's most popular television show. And one of the persistent myths, and they love to rag on this, is that American gas is awful and European gas is awesome, and we just have crappy gas because that's our way in the United States. But in reality, there are two different ways of actually rating octane. There's research octane number, which is RON, and then there's motor octane number, which is MON. And what they generally use in Europe is the research octane number, so RON. And to say the least, the testing conditions are not realistic. So for RON, the test engine that they use to establish the anti-knock runs at 600 RPM. And it does not use preheated fuel, and it does not have a challenging ignition timing. So you wind up with ratings via RON that are typically 8 to 12 octane higher than motor octane number, which is the other rating system, which involves a 900 RPM engine speed, which involves a preheated mixture, which involves variable ignition timing so they can advance the spark timing to really test the volatility and the combustibility of the fuel. Then, if you take both of them together, you get something called AKI, or anti-knock index. Basically, it's the R plus the M, the research plus the motor, divided by 2. So it just averages the two of them. And this typically is going to be about 4 to 6 octane lower than that European RON. So let's take some comparisons directly. Shell V-Power. In Europe, V-Power in the UK is 99 octane. That is equivalent to 93 octane in the US, which is available in almost every state. Shell V-Power in Italy and Germany is 100 octane, because again, it's research octane, and that's the equivalent of 94 in the US. So our 91 to 93 is Europe's 96 to 98. And so that's how the conversion actually works. And a lot of folks think we just have crappy gas. The reality is there's a different rating system. That said,
Fascinating.
isn't that weird? Because you'd think, oh man, every pump in Europe has 100 octane. They're burning aviation fuel. Everything's a hot rod. What's wrong with the United States? We got a different system. It's more honest.
That makes so much sense because even if you start breaking it down of the specifics of the test, 600 RPM is low. I mean, that's like really low. I think my 96 K1500 Chevy has like a factory idle of 650, maybe 700. It's not that low, but it's 900's a little more realistic for an average.
A little bit, but still, you're talking like John Deere engine speed there. You're not talking cars. Now, a fun thing is that in most states, regular, intermediate, and premium are defined by law. So the minimum you can claim is defined by law. So in California, that's actually 87, 89, and 91. In most states, it's 93. So people talk about California gas. It is a little bit lower. That 91 is not going to give you the best performance in your Nissan Z, in your EcoBoost Ford F-150. Really, modern turbocharged cars do thrive on that 93. So you want to try to get 93 if you can. Your car can run on this stuff because anti-knock sensors, and it'll retard spark timing. It'll change the engine profile. But if you can fill with 93, you're going to get the most out of modern turbocharged engines. Be warned, though, the worst gas in the country is actually in Alaska, where regular is 87, intermediate is 88.5, and premium by law can be 90. Yeah. And in Wyoming, where regular can be 85, intermediate's 88, and premium is 91. So that's your worst gas in the United States.
Wow. Good to know that too. For those times where we're going to take a cross-country road trip, hopefully at some point.
Avoid Wyoming.
Yeah. Well, let's jump on a little bit of a safety bandwagon, because nowadays we have all of this driver assistance technology, so much to the point where it is honestly overwhelming if you haven't been in the new car market in quite some time. A lot of standard features nowadays, and there's a lot of like really new tech that's starting to be optional too. But without going into all those specifics, it wasn't until like the early 1990s where the majority of cars, like domestic vehicles, were offered with airbags. A lot of vehicles up until the mid 90s didn't even have airbags, period. The airbag, the concept of an airbag was around since like the 1950s, and there were patents being filed for it in like different forms or another, from like compressed air and whatnot. But it wasn't until like the late 1960s and early 1970s where manufacturers started experimenting with them more, sometimes in government fleets, sometimes as optional features. I think I've never seen one, but in the mid 70s, give or take a few years or so, General Motors was actually offering airbags as optional features on some of their full-size cars like Buicks, Oldsmobiles, and Pontiacs, but they actually stopped because there wasn't a big consumer demand for them at the time. But once that stuff started to become more prevalent, the ball got rolling, as far as just government mandates and stuff, that this is probably a decent idea that we should pursue further. So throughout the 1980s it started to become a little bit more prevalent and stuff, but the 90s really wasn't that long ago. You started having more stuff starting to come out, and then I think airbags were fully mandated as far as every single vehicle needed to have them in 1998, which is crazy because it really wasn't that long ago. I know, looking back, like my 96 Chevy truck only has a driver's side airbag. If something had an airbag, it was most likely only on the driver's side. So sorry, passengers.
Yeah, well, the funny thing is, like on light trucks, you didn't have to have airbags in the U.S. until 1997. So you could be making a light truck, and right up until the 1997 model, you didn't even have a driver's side airbag. You're right about dual airbags. You had to have both of them in 1998 on cars. But I remember back in the 90s, like when a car had side impact airbags, that was almost like an exotic feature. Like you're like, oh my gosh, that's Volvo, Mercedes Benz, Saab. Like you don't get that in a Ford, you don't get that in a GM, you don't even get that in a Cadillac. That was one of those things.
In like the early 2000s, the Ford Panther cars, side impact airbags were optional.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, if you go back to the 70s, like Ford and GM were playing around with this stuff really early. I think Impalas sold to federal fleets, where I don't know why it was for federal sales, but who knows? Maybe they had like a bulk purchase thing, economy of scale. But they were selling a version of the Chevy Impala to federal fleets that had an airbag for the driver. And Every once in a while, you will see like a Cadillac or an Oldsmobile from the period that's got a big fat steering wheel, and that was the beginning of airbags. I wouldn't bank on that working though.
I don't know if I'd want to be hit with one of those. I might want to take my chances otherwise.
And you know, back then that was not like a dual stage, like child safe airbag. That thing was gonna punch you in the face and break your nose. You'd survive, but you'd be ugly. Like that was how it was gonna happen. This thing was not subtle. And it's great that you mentioned that, because so much of what we take for granted today really came about in the 90s. I feel like the two big periods of flux for car technology were like the 50s and the 90s, and we'll probably do a show on each one in the future.
Absolutely. And I wanted to go ahead and make another mention too.
Yeah.
Looking back a little bit further, several decades, a lot of people probably know this, but Volvo was actually the first automotive manufacturer to introduce 3-point seatbelts in 1959. And I think it wasn't commonplace as far as everybody's concerned until the late 60s, maybe 1968. But even then, like our 69 Chevelle, it has lap belts, but the third point is mounted up on the roof, and it's like got like a hook that you like, wrap it up and tie it up on there, and then you just pull it down and clip it in. So it's like it's 3-point, but it's not. But it's just funny to think that for so many, let's just say 5 or 6 decades, if we look back at like horseless carriages and stuff, about how nothing had airbags. My 1948 Ford Super Deluxe, not airbags, seatbelts. My 48 Ford Super Deluxe still to this day does not have seatbelts because I'm a rebel.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, back in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, automakers would sell padded dashes as a safety feature. Like 1/8 of an inch of foam padding was going to save you from like a 45-mile-an-hour
Yes. Yes. I got several brochures for my 56 Ford Crown Victoria, and mine doesn't have the padded dash. It's just metal. But the visors, they had extra padding in those. That was an extra feature. So if you got into a front end collision and weren't wearing your seatbelts, instead of your head going through the the top of the windshield, at least you had a little bit of a visor to catch your head.
It just softened the blow as you hit the glass.
The steering wheel was a new design that was, they didn't have collapsible steering columns back in. So instead of the steering wheel just going right through you, the spokes were designed to give. This was actually a safety feature. When you hit the steering wheel, the spokes were supposed to give you a little cushion since you didn't have an airbag.
It's funny because stuff like that, like padded dashes, they mark a car as like of a period. And speaking of seatbelts, nothing marks a car as like late 80s, early 90s more than automatic powered seatbelts, the kind that attack you when you close the door.
Yes, my 240SX still has those.
You should ask your insurance company, because my dad had a Mazda 626 in the early 90s with that. He didn't sell it till 2004. Right up until the last year he had the car, he got like a $15 insurance break for having those.
Really? Yeah, I'm gonna have to look at that, see if I can save a little bit of monies.
Yeah, there you go. Like after all the money you spent on that car, you're gonna save like $10.
Oh yeah, every little bit counts with that thing.
Boom. Well, I got some fun facts about an American car company that I think we're probably going to look at very differently 20, 30 years down the road, because Don Panos and his son Danny, it's hard to compare them to any one historical person, but in aggregate, they're kind of like Briggs Cunningham, Bill Frant Sr., and Carroll Shelby, because they built road cars that were high performance, inspired by race cars that they raced for championships. And they raced these cars in series that they created because they wanted to have some sort of format to give sporting exposure to their road cars. So the Panos brand started back in the late 80s, and Danny Panos bought car called the TMC Costin, which was the ugliest like Lotus 7 derivative thing you've ever seen in your life. And he kept the chassis. He bought the rights to the chassis. He went down to Brazelton, Georgia. He brought over a couple of folks from the old factory, which I think was in Ireland, and he hired Freeman Thomas, who would later do the new Beetle and the Audi TT, to design it. It was very stripped down. It had a little bit of Cobra, it had a little bit of 32 Ford, it had a little bit of like Allard, and all these things came together in the original Panos Roadster, which was mostly Ford parts, but they did make their own chassis, and they powered it by basically the old 5.0 Mustang Cobra engine from the early 1990s. And that was good. But then in 1996, after they made 44 of those, they came back with the AIV Roadster. That was the aluminum intensive vehicle. And now they were doing things that few others were, because this had aluminum suspension, aluminum chassis, super plastic formed aluminum body panels. The whole thing was 2,500 pounds, and it had the 305 horsepower Romeo 4-valve 4-cam Mustang Cobra engine. And now things got serious. They made 176 of those before the Esperante launched, and this was like their, quote, real car. It had a roof that went up and down with power. It had AC that worked. It had two accommodating seats. It wasn't the raw, build a tent over your head type thing the AIV Roadster was. It was a real car. And they made 233 of those before 2006, and then they made one more that went to the Middle East where there were no crash regulations in 2007. So 44 Roadsters, 176 AIVs, and 234 Esperantes. And that is pretty much the story of Panos Auto development. They had another car recently called the Avezzano, but I don't think they made even 12 of those before they decided they were just going to provide parts, and we don't really know what the future holds. There's one guy working in the old factory doing his best to keep the cars running. If that's all that she wrote, I think someday these cars will be regarded like Cobras.
See, I haven't followed them in quite a few years, but I remember a while back, I actually had the opportunity to go to their factory down in Georgia, and I filmed, I think it was two of them. And at that time, they were producing cars. Like, people were ordering them and they were building them. And at the time, they were developing the Amazzano. I don't think they had a finished one, but it was close. But really fascinating company, especially looking back at their motoring pedigree and whatnot. But that's really interesting. I'm going to have to go back and check it out.
Yeah, and if you think about what the cars won, I mean, let's take a look. There was the 1999 American Le Mans Series overall title in the prototype class, won Sebring in class and the 24 Hours of Le Mans in class with the Esperante, won a Trans Am title, the Indy 500, and you take all of the wins they scored in motorsports, the rarity of the road cars, and frankly, the fact that the road cars are mechanically easy to keep going. If you need body panels or glass, God help you, unless you need an AIV Roadster windshield, in which case Volkswagen Super Beetle, and you're good. That's where they found it.
Wow.
Yeah, and the taillights on the AIV Roadster, you could sit looking at them like scratching your chin thinking, those are familiar, but you probably wouldn't guess Land Rover Defender. That's where they got them.
The more you know.
The more, it's like that rainbow, the more you know.
Absolutely.
That is the story of Panos. Guys, if you're out on Bring a Trailer, buy one. Prices haven't gone crazy yet. I think someday they will.
And it's so, it's really cool because, when I was there, they were advertising it as a hand-built American supercar. And like you said, all the drivetrain and stuff was Ford. So, I mean, body panels and interior parts and whatnot aside, mechanically, they're very simple and a reliable setup.
Yeah, that's a fact. And the bottom line is that in terms of maintaining them, anything you need, you're going to find at your Ford dealer. And I would even go so far as say one more note on this. People who are confused over like their production eras, they made the Esperante from 2001 to 2006, and that's when they stopped making cars altogether until starting up again with the Avezzano in 2015, but they made very, very few of those. But that's sort of why it seems like they fell off the face of the earth for most of a decade. They sort of did.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely, everybody listening to this podcast, go to my YouTube channel, Saabkyle04, and type in Panos. I did a factory tour, and I think I know the reviews are on there too. I just can't remember how many there are, but definitely unique. here's another something random for you.
All
Did
right.
you know that the last uh, optional cassette player in a vehicle was the 2011 Ford Crown Victoria?
I did not know that, but it sort of makes sense.
It does. And now you can't even hardly find CD players anymore.
I think the last one was the outgoing Lexus RX. It had like the in-dash CD player and an infotainment system from a billion years ago, and I think that was officially the last of the CD players.
Gosh, I can't remember. There was one vehicle. There was a press vehicle I had over the last 6 months, I think, and it was oh, what was it? What was it? The Volvo XC90. The current generation XC90 has an option. I don't know if they still do, but at least since 2016, they had the option of a center console mounted CD player. So
Oh,
for
wow.
millennials who have booklets of CDs and stuff, there is still hope.
There are all sorts of weird, like automotive media formats. Back in the 50s, they had these weird miniature records that you could play in record players inside your car. And, in the 70s, they had 8-track. And I don't know if there were any cars that had it here in the United States, but for a period in the 90s, mini discs were a really big thing, and you could get mini disc players in your car. That will not have aged well.
I don't even know what that is.
There you go. You got something to Google later on tonight.
Yes.
All right. So here's a fun one from American automotive history. Duesenberg. We know them well. Crafters of race cars and road cars for kings. They made 445 Duesenberg J's. Very impressive. An engine with 4 valves per cylinder, dual overhead cams, Hemi heads, integral cylinder head, everything that had to be serviced was serviced by taking the engine out and going in through the bottom. So a very advanced engine that made 265 horsepower, naturally aspirated. But they made 36 of them with a supercharger, and this was called the SJ. And so a lot of folks wonder why the SJ has exhaust pipes coming out the flank of the engine bay, whereas or I should say the J, doesn't have any visible exhaust pipes coming out the side of the car. Well, the reason is the supercharger in the SJ was about the size of, I'd say it's about the size of a large coffee maker. So it was enormous. It was shaft driven and it sat on the passenger side of the car. So where you would normally have the exhaust manifold on a standard Duesenberg J, you instead had this enormous shaft driven power takeoff from the engine. Then you had the compressor, which was, again, like the size of a coffee can. Then on top of that, you had the manifold where the fuel was added, and that would arc over to the other side of the engine. So you had this huge apparatus that forced Duesenberg to route the exhaust out the side of the car to go straight out over all this mechanism and then dive south into the fender outside of the engine bay, which created one of the most, I would say, appealing automotive engineering solutions of all time, so much so that later on J owners would have their cars converted with the external exhaust routing just because it looked cool.
Man, can you imagine seeing that going down the road back in the day?
No way. I mean, it made 320 horsepower in standard spec. They
Gosh.
made 2 of them, the SSJ, which was an SJ with a short wheelbase, that made 400 horsepower. And it was built
I just can't even fathom that with the technology they had back then.
I can't imagine either. Maybe that's the reason why some Duesenbergs cost more than $20,000 in 1930s money. It gets even better because I went and I checked, and back in 1998 at auction, I think it was Christie's, someone bought a full shaft power takeoff, supercharger, carburetor, and manifold from an SJ. This was in 1998. Someone basically bought the full setup to make an SJ, and that component in 98 sold for $266,000.
Wow. I
Yeah.
think in the 50s, I think you could get a fully loaded Bel Air hardtop delivered for less than $2,000.
I think in 1998 you could buy like a 550 Maranello for $266,000. That's just for the supercharger.
Good gracious.
My goodness, Kyle, hit me.
All right, so let's go to the movie side of the automotive scene for a second. Did you know in Back to the Future, which is one of my favorite trilogies of all time, that the original time machine was supposed to be a refrigerator and not a car?
I'm so happy they didn't go with that because I heard rumors that it was supposed to be a pickup truck. I didn't realize initially it was supposed to be a fridge. The pickup would have been a big upgrade over the fridge, but I like the DeLorean best.
Apparently, the director, Robert Zemeckis, thought that too many kids would try to mimic this thing at home and trap themselves in the refrigerator.
I mean, yeah, good call. I can also imagine it being a little bit similar to the TARDIS from Doctor Who, which was a phone booth. And
Yes.
I can see a little bit of that there. Uh, I understand that Back to the Future's got a little bit of like a comic sensibility to it. I mean, after all, Darth Vader wearing a rad suit in the 1950s didn't happen, but it was a brilliant idea. I think the fridge would have been like a step too far. Like, I don't think there's ever been a good movie that prominently features a refrigerator. And as an example, I cite Indiana Jones 4 when he gets into a fridge to avoid being nuked, and it ruined the movie in the first 10 minutes.
Yes. Absolutely.
So here's the funny thing. You mentioned the fridge, and that flows directly into my next fun fact, which is that the first fully integrated climate control system in a car. It wasn't the first AC, but it was the first integrated heater air conditioner, was the Nash Weathereye back in 1954. Now, Nash was formerly Nash Kelvinator, and Kelvinator made refrigeration systems. So they drew on their experience making fridges and freezers to create the Weathereye. And Nash was a budget compact car company. They had the most advanced climate control system in the world. One sliding scale would allow you to blend air conditioning with heat to find any temperature between cold and hot that you wanted. And unlike early AC systems, which tended to sit in the trunk, whereas the heater was in the front, the Nash was fully integrated underneath the hood. It was very compact. So, for example, if you bought a 1953 Cadillac, you would have basically a refrigerator by Frigidaire in the trunk. Then you'd have a heating system up in the front. Nash not only integrated them under the hood, but they created one climate control system, and it was basically set it and forget it. And they were the first to have that in the industry.
I don't know why. I always thought the Weather Eye was some kind of like radio device or something.
Well, it
My
sounds like
mind is blown.
well, because you think like you'd think, oh, well, you use it to get the weather, so it must be like a radio,
Right.
like AM radio. But yeah, fully integrated climate control. And the Nashes, they were powered by straight sixes that were flatheads. They were very basic cars. This was a surprising place for something like that to show up.
I had the opportunity to check out a Nash not too long ago. And, part of me was like, man, that thing is so cool. And you don't see them. I want it. But at the same time, where am I going to find parts for it? But on the data tag and stuff, I noticed that it was Nash Kelvinator. And I was like, what?
Oh
That's so
yeah.
cool and random at the same time.
And when we do our 1950s episode, maybe we'll get to talk a little bit about how 1954, the merger of Nash and Hudson created American Motors, and that's a story for another time, I
Oh,
think.
I'm looking forward to that.
All right, hit me, Kyle. What you got?
So, in World War II, automotive production ceased. Depending on the manufacturer, I can't remember if there was like a set date or something, but it was around 1942. So, over the span of World War II, there was only legitimately only like 139 cars produced because the vast majority of manufacturing processes was going over to war effort, planes, tanks, you name it, whatever used steel, that's what was going on. So in 1947, excuse me, 19 it came out in 1946. So Studebaker was the first manufacturer to actually launch an all new car post World War II. And I wrote it down right here just so I wouldn't forget it. Their slogan, I believe it was the Studebaker Champion. There was all sorts of models and stuff, but it was first by far with a post war car. And my 49 Commander that I have is the same generation body style that came out in 47. Um, it's really interesting because my 48 Ford in 1948, for this particular line, the deluxe and the super deluxe, 48 was the last year of what they called the pre-war body. I also have a 40 Ford, and you can see there's some differences and whatnot, but you can see the original lineage of that. And it's just crazy to think that, in 46, the vast majority of manufacturers were just rehashing pre-war bodies with extra trim and fancy bits and stuff just to try to, whet the appetite of hungry consumers. But can you imagine going that long without having vehicles being available aside from just used stuff?
I can imagine it's probably even worse than it sounds because World War II came on the back of a decade of Great Depression. And a lot of people were still driving their jalopies from the 20s. So there was this huge replacement cycle and there was an insatiable demand for cars. And after the rationing of World War II, the federal government imposed price controls so you couldn't just charge whatever you wanted for a new car. And there was just such a crush of demand for everything that was consumer facing. And some unscrupulous dealers actually kind of reminds me of what is going on now with like C8 Corvettes and Hummer EVs and Ford Lightnings and Rivians. But some dealers would take the car, drive it around the block in 1946, 47, 48, and they would sell it as a used car so they could charge whatever they wanted for it.
What?
Yeah. The more things change, right?
I was about to say, it's not just with all the ones that you mentioned. It's Jeeps, it's Challengers, it's everything. It's crazy. It
Yeah, it
also
really
depends
is.
on where you're at.
It's everything except Camaros, I think. Sorry, Chevy. Speaking of Chevy, some fun facts about the way these Corvettes are built underneath the skin. Of course, over the years, we've had sheet molding compound and various forms of fiberglass, but the rare unibody Corvette was the C4. So, following three generations of body on frame construction with the C1, C2, and C3, we got the C4 in 1984, and they really did try to make everything different. This was the only Corvette that used a unibody, which meant if you stripped off all the body panels, the first and most surprising thing you would find is that the rear quarter panels of the car are actually metal and they're integral to the frame, just like on a standard unibody. And you don't get a body on frame so much as you get a weird collection of stampings and extrusions that are welded together. And so it is a unibody that doesn't have outer body panels, quarter panels on the rear notwithstanding. So that was the only Corvette with a unibody. And after that, the C5, 6, and 7 all went back to using a perimeter frame, which was a type of body on frame construction that dates back to the 50s. That's why some people, who have like salvage titles or reconstructed C5s and C6s, they pull off all the body panels and they turn them into dune buggies because you can absolutely operate them without any body panels. And they look great out on the dunes. You can't do that with a C4.
Fascinating. Vet cart.
Yeah. The C4, the only ever unibody Corvette. So if you ever wanted to know why every C4 flexes and rattles, it's because you don't get the same structural integrity with a unibody that lacks exterior body panels that you can get with a perimeter frame on like a C5, 6, or 7. That's why the C4 has a reputation for being just full of squeaks and rattles. It's not that so badly built. It's just the way it's built under the skin.
I gotta go find a C4 and drive it.
Make it a 0 1.
There you go. At least it's a cool one.
Yeah, the best of them.
So, we've talked about just how complicated and advanced vehicles are nowadays. One thing that is concerning of me over time is how that's going to affect the longevity of some of our more favorite new cars. And both of us we're very much into collector cars and classic cars and all this kind of stuff. And something has to be said about the beauty, the simplicity of less is more in certain aspects and stuff. And that's what I love about my old cars. But I was doing a little bit of digging with one of my reviews way back, and the Bentley Bentayga, Bentley's SUV. has over 100 million lines of code that goes into programming one of those. And that's just one example. If you really, really dive into a lot, not just exotics, like regular stuff too, like the integrated systems from the Charger and Challenger, and like all the big Mopar performance vehicles and stuff. How many integrated systems are controlled from one central screen? Like, wow.
Yeah, it's amazing to think. And I just read a story about a group out of Texas that was doing a 1,500 horsepower C8 Corvette twin turbo conversion. And the biggest problem they ran into, and it's actually good if you're a consumer, it's bad if you're a hot rodder, but GM's Global B engine management system is designed to ensure that when you have a connected car that can be accessed remotely over the internet, that the engine management system can't be like ransomwared. So you can't hack the engine management system to change its operation. This is great if you don't want your car to be ransomwared. Like, I would hate to start up my car and see like, you must give $1,000 to North Korea and then we will unlock your engine. So they have a great encryption on the Global B engine management system, but it was so persistently difficult for these hot rodders to get through this that they had to just go the route of getting a second injection system alongside the direct injection for the primary C8 fuel management. It's almost like the second set of injectors on the old LT5 and the original 90 to 95 ZR1. And so they created port injection with a modified manifold that had 8 extra injectors. And so the car now has direct and port injection because they just cannot get around the code of the standard engine management. So they have a second ECU and a second set of port-specific injectors that come online when the car is using its turbo power. So it is now port and direct injected with 2 separate parallel ECUs. And I can imagine everything about tuning and modding and restoring cars will change in the future because of electronics.
Oh my goodness, mind blown.
What a headache. I mean, come on.
I
Yikes.
had a hard enough time with the ECM and the 240.
It's just going to be like in the future, if we want to tune a C8 or a C9 or whatever, we're just going to drop in like an LS1 or an LS2.
That's like the most complicated we're going right there.
Get rid of the engine in the car and throw in some old port injected LS or LT, because we're not going to bother reprogramming this thing.
No, because when all of the electronics are obsolete and not supported anymore, what are you going to do?
Nothing. You're going to swap in like a Chevy small block from the past. That's what you're going to do.
It's going to be like your Fisker that you used to have. You're going to find some guy in a back alley with like the emulator on his computer or something. Be like, I got what you need. I got your C8 programming right here.
Yeah, it's going to be like behind like the muffler shop. It's going to be like the guys dealing dope behind the local gym. Hey, you want to pump more iron? I got something that'll help. Hey, an ECU cracker for like a C8 Corvette. May void your warranty.
Oh, that's awesome.
So now here's a fun fact. Okay, so what if there were a super rare Mopar and no one wanted it? So in 1971, there were about 35, 36 Charger RTs made with the last of the 426 Street Hemis. So they made 35 of these things, super rare, super valuable. You got one that's numbers matching, you can basically name your price. But back in 2008, at the tail end, just before the bankruptcy, at the tail end of Dodge Durango and Chrysler Aspen production, Mopar launched its first hybrid vehicle. You could get it as a Durango, or you could get it as a Chrysler Aspen, which existed. I have to emphasize, a lot of people have forgotten it, but between the two of them, they made about 800 of them. And this may be the rarest modern Mopar, especially since the Aspen was less produced than the Durango hybrid. So let's say there are 200-300 Aspen hybrids out there. It's like that old saying, if a tree falls in the forest and no one can hear it, does it make a sound? If there's a super rare Mopar and no one wants it, does it ever become collectible?
I guess that depends on how functional it is.
Yeah, right. Well, here's the thing. It's genuinely interesting and rare. And I mean, as a practical vehicle, you can put bikes in the back, you can put surfboards on the top. If it weren't an embarrassingly 2000s era, like Durango trying to be a Chrysler 300, the Aspen might actually be pretty cool. So I don't know if this will ever be interesting to Mopar guys. Just like I don't know if the 1981 to 83 Imperial will ever be interesting to Mopar guys. But the rarity is there, just waiting for someone to love it and collect it. And I hope, for the sake of posterity, that at least one person feels that and gets that bug.
I believe that. There's always a pocket of passionate people for odd things.
Yes, someone will preserve and restore like a Subaru Baja. That will happen. There will be at least one.
Yeah, there you go.
Right. What's up next on the agenda?
So, NASCAR. I'm sure I'm not. Well, I don't know if you know this. I'm sure a lot of other people know. Who knows? But NASCAR's original origins had to do with in the Prohibition era. Did you know that?
This is going to be great because this is segueing with one of my points. I'm going to
Cool.
thank you so much.
So the whole original idea of NASCAR was basically getting all of these guys together who are backwoods moonshiners, and everybody trying to one up each other with their quote stock cars. That's where the term came from. You would have all of these cars back in the 30s, 40s, whatever, that were very unassuming, because obviously you don't want to draw attention to yourself, but everybody was souping them up with different heads, bigger carburetors, and all this stuff. All of the vast myriad of mechanical tuning that's just seemingly lost nowadays for the most part. But that's what it was for the longest time. And when you look back and see like all of the like real iconic drivers from back in the day, like they all had origins in moonshining. I know people over the last 2-3 decades that still did it.
Oh, it's great that you mentioned this because I remember reading, I think it was Junior Johnson at some point, but his whole family got arrested for moonshining, and he had the only alibi, which was that he was racing at the time. So he was the only one who didn't get busted. Thank you so much for setting this up, because my next fun fact is about Jerry Elijah Rushing. He was born in 1937. He died in 2017, and he was a good old boy. And he was born into a illegal whiskey distilling family, and he was famous as a bootlegger and a moonshiner. And the old phrase was Thunder Road, where these guys would try to elude the federal revenue officers at night. And he inspired the Dukes of Hazzard, because during the late 50s and early 60s, in his modified Chrysler 300D, he had a 300-gallon tank for White Lightning in the back of this car. If you guys remember the 300 C and D, they were the Hemi-powered Virgil Exner forward-look cars. Really cool. His was modified to carry 300 gallons of shine, but there was more. He had one switch that would cut out the taillights, which was super cool because it was hard to follow what you can't see. And James Bond style, he had an oil slick dump. So he was decked out, and you could get a lot of different axle ratios in your Chrysler back then. And he had like a 297 or something. So the thing was geared for 140 miles an hour. And with 375 horsepower, it could do it too. He named his car Traveler, which was after one of Robert E. Lee's horses. And when the time came, studio executives came to him and they offered to pay him for the rights to his life story. And he was the direct inspiration for the Dukes of Hazzard and Bo Duke specifically. And because there was no way they were going to find enough functional 300 Cs and Ds at the time, they decided they would just use a contemporary car. So they chose the Dodge Charger, which was easy. That's the General Lee. And even the car called the General Lee was a play on Traveler, which was General Lee's horse on the original car that Jerry Rushing owned. And he sold off the rights to his story thinking that he was going to be like a recurring character on the show. And though he did make a few cameos, he never quite got what he thought was coming to him. So he kind of got hoodwinked a little bit. He was a trusting soul, but that's where the Dukes of Hazzard came from, and possibly the best ever Mopar story that doesn't involve actual NASCAR racing.
So funny. Dodge Charger, that Dodge Charger considered contemporary. Now it's like the holy grail.
Yeah, right. There was a time, even in the 90s, when you could buy those things with 383s and 440s for like $5,000 in driver condition. How times have changed. Like back then, you couldn't, when they made that show and the Dukes of Hazzard movies, you couldn't find a functional Chrysler 300. Now you can't find a Dodge Charger that's cheap to buy.
It's wild. It makes me sad.
That is the story of Jerry Rushing. But what you got for me, Kyle?
Well, something else that kind of makes me sad is the availability of manual transmissions is dropping like left and right. I was reading a survey from back in 2019, and at that time, only about 5% of new vehicles sold in the United States were offered with a manual transmission. And I would probably argue to say that it's even less now. The new Supra just came out with a manual option, which is pretty awesome, and the new Z is offered with a manual. And of course, you got the Challenger, Mustang, and Camaro. I mean, aside from just the legit performance cars, there's really nothing. And pretty much all of the quote more elite cars like Porsche, Mercedes, so on and so forth, they haven't had manuals for a while. I'm trying to remember the last 911 that had the option of a manual. But yeah, and I think
I think on the GT3s, that's the only place where you could get it. I think it was the GT3s kept the manual flame burning. But
and it's just so unfortunate because there are a lot of people that enjoy driving manuals but don't want to buy a sports car.
Well, the funny thing is, the most interesting thing going right now in like manual transmissions, aside from the new Supra, which just showed up with a box that's, I believe, by BMW. It's the BMW gearbox, but it's modified and calibrated by Toyota. Koenigsegg, the supercar, hypercar company from Sweden, they have a new manual transmission. And it's weird because it can operate as a full automatic or as a true gated with a clutch 3-pedal manual. And I'm going to give them credit for making a manual transmission because reportedly there's a certain setting where you can actually stall it, which in my opinion makes it a true manual, regardless of what else it can do.
Koenigsegg, if you haven't followed them before, it is amazing what he has done with that company and the innovations that they have developed. Like, you may not be into hypercars and supercars and all that kind of stuff, but the amount of technology that has come from that company is astounding. And, bringing things into a little bit more of a realistic perspective, one of the most fun manual transmissions I've ever experienced is the 6th gen Camaro and the C7 Vet. The C7 Vet had a 7-speed manual, and then the 6th gen Camaro had a 6-speed, but they both had an automatic rev match feature that you could toggle on and off whenever you want. And I'm pretty sure the new Z has that too.
Yes.
But what's really cool about that is that you've got the wonderfulness of a manual transmission, and you can downshift and rev match all you want, just like any old manual. But if you wanted to drive it on a track or something, which I had the opportunity to drive them both on the track, different press events, you can be cooking that thing all the way, over 100 miles an hour and just take the tightest turn and just downshift at the very last second and not have to worry about fiddling with your feet and stuff. And it'll just automatically just bring the revs up and you just go. So it's like a semi manual or semi-automatic or something. It was cool.
Yeah, it makes you sound like a hero. Like the people in the stands and alongside the track and be like, "Whoa, that guy's an ace!" You're just jamming it into second gear from like fifth. You're like, You figure it out, computer. Rim,
Yeah,
rim, rim, rim. Oh, damn. He's good.
yeah, he's so good. They look in the car and be like, man, it's a manual. It sounded like it was an automatic. They'll never know.
Only you and your transmission will ever be aware. But it's funny because I got another NASCAR fact. I didn't think I'd go so NASCAR heavy today, but back in 1954, in the decidedly non-traditional NASCAR market of Linden, New Jersey, on an airport course converted for a NASCAR Grand National race. Grand National back then was like the Cup Series. It was the premier class. Al Keller won the race in a Jaguar XK120 coupe. And this race also included other Jags and MGs. And that would be the last foreign car to win a NASCAR Premier Series event until Kyle Busch with Toyota in 2008, I believe.
Wow.
Is that weird? And I checked and it gets weirder. Although they didn't win races in period in the 50s, we also had NASCAR entries from Volkswagen Beetles, Citroën ID19s, and Porsche 356s. This is what I miss about NASCAR, the time when you could have all sorts of machines from different countries, front engine, rear engine, 6 cylinders, 8, 4. I wish there was still something like that in stock car racing today. It doesn't have to be the Cup Series. It would be really cool if like a feeder series used like production-based vehicles. I would love to see that. I know that NASCAR would say that's IMSA, but I would still love to see it in stock car racing.
Well, NASCAR has gotten so regulated. I mean, everybody's basically driving the same chassis, and it's just up to like little tweaks and stuff here and there. So I mean, it it levels the playing field. So the real skill, of the driver, that's really what matters, and luck. But there's something that has to be said about the simplicity of how it was as well, and the variety, and like the old school excitement. Like you see Richard Petty driving his car with one hand, smoking a cigarette in the other hand, like
Yeah, back when you didn't even have to wear a helmet, like
right.
but there were great cars from like the experimental period of NASCAR. We don't get Charger Daytonas and Plymouth Superbirds without variability in the rules that allowed that kind of car to be made. The 426 Hemi revived the Hemi in 1964 because Chrysler wanted to go racing with it, and they weren't allowed to race with it in 65 because they had to actually build it for the road, and that's where the street Hemi came from 66 to 1971. And you just look at all the mechanical diversity that existed back then. And I don't think you can have a production-based car going 200 miles an hour on a super speedway. I don't care how well that thing crashes in like federal government testing, that thing's going to fold if it hits the wall. But it'd be great if there were like, I don't know, a lower level formula with slower speeds where you could still say, yeah, you know what, that's a lot like the car I can buy on the road. That would be fun. That would be cool.
I never really thought about it, but there were a lot of models over the last several decades, and really nothing in the last 20 years that I can think of. You would see all these experimental like design cues and stuff that they were doing on the track, and they had to make production readily available, like certain amount of numbers or percentages or whatever. I mean, one thing that kind of comes to mind is the late 80s Monte Carlo SS Aero Coupe. Remember that?
Yeah. Yes, I do. That was the very tail end of production-based NASCAR. Like once the late 80s was done, we were fiberglass panels, tube frame construction, standardized chassis. A lot of the fun was gone. I would say by the time Richard Petty retired in the early 90s, all of the production-based fun had left NASCAR.
The stock cars aren't so stock anymore.
No. The weird thing is now they're talking about having some sort of like feeder series for NASCAR that involves EVs. That might wind up being the most production-based NASCAR series of the modern era, and I never thought I would say that.
Interesting.
How many fun facts do we have left? I've got one. How many have you got?
I'm fresh out.
Okay, so we're going to talk about a president and his beloved German car. It's well known that Donald Trump has owned a number of German cars, but we're going to go further back to the 1960s. The president was Lyndon Johnson, and the car was an Ampha car. We're going to go back further now to the 1940s and World War II. But Ferdinand Porsche developed the Type 166 Schwimmwagen for the German Wehrmacht, and it was basically the Kubelwagen, the German Jeep, but with four-wheel drive and with amphibious capability. So it was quite literally what the name suggested. The Schwimmwagen was a wagon that could swim. And the exact same engineers came back in the 60s and they're like, you know what? We're going to make a fortune in the American market. We're going to sell them a civilian version of the Schwimmwagen, and we're going to call it the Amphicar, and we're going to make tons of money. And so from 61 to 65, they didn't make tons of money, but they built 3,878 of these amphibious cars. They were German made with a Triumph engine. And they had like an Audi Quattro Sport, like 84-inch wheelbase. So these things can almost turn in their length when they're on land, like less than 37 feet. But it was the fact that you take them in the water, and they had all of the required Coast Guard features, including navigation lights and a little flag staff. And President Lyndon Johnson, he was a Texan down at his ranch. He had one of these, and he had a pond. And he would go barreling toward the pond and try to freak out his guests by claiming he'd lost his brakes and they were going into the water. And so by the time they figured out what was happening, they'd be floating and motoring along. But that's how he freaked people out with his Amphicar. And, Lyndon Johnson, a controversial president, no doubt, but I think we can all agree that the Amphicar is like politically unifying. I think right and left both love a car that can float.
That is so cool.
Postscript to that, when I was a kid in high school, there was this website, amphicar.com, where people who collected these things traded parts and like sold them amongst each other. And they'd say back then, well, if you want one that can float, you're going to need to pay as much as $15,000 to $20,000. And maybe the best one in the world is 30 grand. Now you go on Bring a Trailer, you will find no shortage of people paying 120, 130, even 140,000 for these things. How times have changed.
Yes, they have.
All right, Kyle, where can they find us online? Social media rundown.
Mine is Saabkyle04 on YouTube and Saabkyle04 LLC on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.
And I am Tim_Masso on Instagram, Watchbox Reviews on YouTube. I'm Tim, he's Kyle, and thanks for logging on.